The silence lasted exactly 1 second before the illusion of our civilized Thanksgiving dinner shattered completely. Madison did not gasp in shock. She did not cry. She erupted. Her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as she lunged across the mahogany table with terrifying speed. Her manicured hand flew through the air, and before I could even brace myself, she slapped me hard across the left side of my face. The sharp cracking sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. The sheer force of her swing knocked her arm directly into my full glass of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. The crystal shattered against the table edge, sending a tidal wave of dark red wine splashing heavily onto my pristine white silk dress. The cold liquid soaked instantly through the expensive fabric, leaving a massive blood-like stain across my chest and lap. My cheek burned with a stinging, furious heat, the imprint of her heavy diamond rings leaving a sharp scratch near my jawline. I sat perfectly still, my breathing slow and measured, waiting for the inevitable parental intervention. I waited for my father to shout at her for resorting to physical violence. I waited for my mother to hand me a napkin and ask if I was hurt. Neither of those things happened. Instead, my mother leaped from her chair and rushed entirely around the table, completely ignoring my bleeding cheek and ruined dress. She grabbed Madison by the shoulders, her voice trembling with frantic, misplaced concern. "Madison, sweetie, are you all right? Take deep breaths. Remember the baby. Did any of the glass cut you? Did that awful wine ruin your maternity gown?" Madison clutched her stomach, performing a dramatic, breathless sob that belonged on a soap opera. She leaned heavily against Jamal, burying her face in his tailored shoulder. "She is trying to destroy us, Mom. She is fabricating these disgusting lies to ruin my marriage and stress out my baby. I cannot believe my own sister would be this evil." My father slammed his heavy fist down on the table with enough force to rattle the serving dishes. His face was purple with pure rage, a vein bulging visibly in his neck. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You are a sick, twisted girl, Becca!" he roared, his spit flying across the table. "I invited you into my home out of pure pity. We threw you a lifeline today, a chance to be part of something great, and this is how you repay us, by presenting forged fake documents at the dinner table to tear down a brilliant man. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter spinster who cannot stand the sight of a happy marriage." "Dad, the documents on that iPad have official SEC watermarks," I said, keeping my voice incredibly flat, refusing to let my emotions bleed through. "I am a distressed debt investor. I analyze financial fraud for a living. I am trying to protect you from federal investigations before Jamal takes everything you own." "Shut your mouth," he bellowed, cutting me off completely. "You are just furious because no man wants you. You look at your sister carrying a beautiful child, building a brilliant future with a highly successful CEO, and it eats you alive. You have spent your entire adult life trying to tear her down just because you are incapable of finding love or building a real family of your own." My mother turned her glare toward me, her eyes narrowing with absolute contempt. "You always do this, Becca. You always have to be the center of attention and ruin everything. When Madison had her beautiful wedding, you threw a tantrum about your college fund and moved out. Now she is pregnant and you are literally inventing financial crimes just to steal her spotlight. You are socially unfit for this family." Jamal stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with a look of profound manufactured disappointment. He played the victim with chilling perfection. "Richard, Patricia, I am so deeply sorry my success has caused this kind of toxic jealousy in your home. Becca, if you needed financial help, you could have just asked me. You did not have to invent these ridiculous conspiracy theories about my accounts. My investors are some of the most respected venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. You are just a debt collector. You simply do not understand high-level tech valuations." I slowly wiped a drop of red wine from my chin, locking eyes with my brother-in-law. "Venture capitalists do not wire seed funding to personal accounts in the Cayman Islands, Jamal, and they certainly do not use investor capital to pay off Madison's black card." My father slammed his fist down again, permanently silencing the room. The rage in his eyes was absolute. There was no father looking at a daughter in that moment. There was only an arrogant, status-obsessed man defending his fragile ego and his golden child. He marched to the front of the dining room and pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy oak front door. Outside, the freezing New York winter wind was howling, whipping heavy snow against the glass panes. "You are a toxic, cold-hearted snake, Becca. I will not allow you to poison this family for one more second," Richard declared, his voice dripping with finality. "Get out of my house and never come back." Any normal person would have broken down right there. Any normal daughter would have cried, pleaded her case, or screamed at the sheer injustice of being assaulted, gaslit, and banished while trying to save her family from total financial ruin. But I was not a normal daughter anymore. They had killed that vulnerable version of me 15 years ago. I stood up slowly, the soaked silk of my dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg. I reached up and gently touched my stinging red cheek, feeling the slight trace of blood where Madison's ring had scratched me. Then I looked at my father, looked at Madison, hiding behind her con artist husband, and I smiled. It was a chilling, dead-eyed smile that made the temperature in the dining room drop another 10 degrees. I let the silence stretch, allowing my unsettling smile to burn itself into their memories. Slowly and deliberately, I picked up a clean linen napkin from the table. I did not dab at my ruined silk dress. I brought the cloth to my cheek, wiping away the small bead of blood and the splattered wine with absolute terrifying calm. I folded the napkin into a perfect square and placed it gently next to my untouched dinner plate. I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand foyer. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished Italian marble floor, a steady beat that echoed through the cavernous space. My mother could not let me leave in peace. Patricia followed right on my heels, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo of insults as I opened the mahogany coat closet. "You are a disgrace," she spat, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "We invite you here out of the goodness of our hearts, and you act like a savage. Look at you. You are 33 years old, and you have absolutely nothing to show for it. No husband, no children, just a sad, pathetic little apartment and a worthless career." I slid my arms into my black cashmere coat, adjusting the collar. I did not look at her yet. I just let her talk. "You think you are so smart," Patricia scoffed, pacing behind me. "You think looking at spreadsheets makes you superior. You are nothing but a glorified debt collector, a bottom feeder. You scavenge off other people's misery while Jamal and Madison are actually creating value in this world. You are a vulture, Becca. That is why nobody wants you." I picked up my leather handbag and my car keys. I turned to face her, catching sight of Richard Madison and Jamal standing at the entrance to the dining room, watching my departure like a victorious royal court banishing a peasant. "A vulture?" I repeated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "That is a very interesting choice of words, Mom, because vultures only circle when they smell something dead." My father sneered, stepping up beside my mother. "Just get out, and do not expect a phone call on Christmas. You are dead to us." I wrapped my scarf around my neck and placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door. The chill of the metal seeped through my gloves. I looked at the four of them, memorizing the arrogant, secure expressions on their faces. "I will gladly leave," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the grand foyer. "But I highly suggest you go back in there and eat as much of that roasted turkey as you possibly can. Savor the expensive wine. Enjoy the warmth of that fireplace." Madison rolled her eyes, leaning her head on Jamal's shoulder. "Oh my God, stop being so dramatic and just leave." I ignored her, locking my gaze directly onto my father. "Because by sunrise, Richard, not a single plate, not a single chair, and not a single brick in this house will belong to you." Madison threw her head back and let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was that sharp, condescending sound she had used to belittle me since we were teenagers. "You are completely insane," she giggled, waving her diamond-clad hand at me. "You are literally making empty threats because you are embarrassed. Just go home to your cats, Becca." Richard shook his head in disgust. "Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic." But I was not looking at Madison, and I was not looking at Richard. I was looking at Jamal. His fake million-dollar smile had completely vanished. The arrogant posture he had maintained all evening had collapsed. His eyes were wide, darting from my face to the iPad still resting on the dining room table and back to my eyes. He was a con artist, and con artists possessed an animal instinct for survival. He recognized the exact moment the hunt shifted. He knew I was not making a scene out of jealousy. He knew I worked in distressed debt. He knew I bought up toxic liabilities. And most importantly, he knew his own dark secrets. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. I pushed down the heavy brass handle and pulled the front door open. The freezing New York winter wind howled into the foyer, blasting snow across the polished marble floor. The sudden drop in temperature made my mother gasp and cross her arms tighter. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said, stepping out into the brutal cold and pulling the door firmly shut behind me. The freezing air whipped against my wet dress beneath my coat, biting into my skin, but I felt absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated focus. I walked down the brick pathway toward my Range Rover, parked in the circular driveway. The snow was falling heavily now, coating the manicured lawns of Greenwich in a thick layer of white. I unlocked my car, the headlights flashing in the dark. Before I could even reach the handle, the heavy front door of the mansion burst open behind me. "Wait." The panicked shout cut through the howling wind. I turned around. Jamal came sprinting out into the freezing snow. He had not even stopped to grab his coat. He was running across the icy driveway in his expensive tailored suit, his dress shoes slipping on the slick bricks. The confident tech CEO was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified man who had just realized the floor beneath his feet was made of glass and I was holding the hammer. I stood by my car door watching him scramble toward me, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Jamal closed the distance between us in seconds. The heavy snow was already accumulating on the shoulders of his custom-tailored suit jacket, melting instantly against his heated, panicked skin. His expensive leather loafers lost traction on the icy driveway, causing him to stumble awkwardly before he caught his balance. The polished, charismatic executive who had just been holding court in my parents' dining room was completely erased. In his place stood a frantic, sweating man whose carefully constructed house of cards was suddenly vibrating under the weight of severe reality. He did not stop at a polite conversational distance. He kept walking until he was mere inches away from me, using his commanding height to loom over my frame. His broad shoulders blocked out the warm glow of the mansion's porch lights, casting a dark, imposing shadow over me. He took another step forward deliberately, backing me right up against the freezing metal door of my Range Rover. It was a classic corporate intimidation tactic. Use physical space to dominate, project blind aggression, force the opponent to shrink and submit. I felt the icy steel of the car door pressing through my cashmere coat, but I kept my spine perfectly straight. I did not shrink. I tilted my chin up and met his furious, panicked gaze without a single flinch. "Listen to me very carefully, Becca," Jamal hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl that my parents had never heard. The smooth, charming cadence he used to woo my father was entirely absent. "I do not know what kind of sick game you think you are playing in there. I do not know what fake spreadsheets you managed to scrape together to try and ruin my night. But you are going to walk away right now and keep your damn mouth shut. Do you understand me? You are not going to say another word to Richard, to Patricia, or to anyone in my professional network." I remained perfectly silent, studying the erratic pulse beating rapidly at the base of his neck. My calculated silence only made him angrier. He slammed his hand flat against the window of my car, trapping me between his arms. "I know people, Becca," he threatened, leaning in closer, a cloud of expensive cologne and hot breath washing over my face. "Powerful people. I sit on boards with venture capitalists who can crush your little debt collection career with one phone call. I will drag your name through the mud in every financial circle in Manhattan. I will tell them you are unstable, that you fabricate documents out of petty family jealousy. I will sue you for corporate espionage and defamation until you are living out of a cardboard box. If you try to sabotage my investors, I will personally guarantee that you never work in this industry again." When the threats failed to produce a reaction, his eyes darted around the snowy driveway. The panic was starting to override his anger. He lowered his voice, shifting to a desperate conspiratorial whisper. Look, I can cut you in, Jamal offered, trying to deploy his salesman charm. 10% of the Series B funding, pure liquid cash. Just walk away and let me secure this bridge loan. You are a businesswoman, let us make a deal. He expected fear. He expected me to apologize or at least attempt to negotiate his bribe. He expected the traditional dynamic where men like him bullied and bought women like me into submission. I reached up and calmly brushed a snowflake from the lapel of his ruined suit. 0742998 I said. My voice was steady, quiet, and absolutely lethal. Jamal stopped breathing. The aggressive posture instantly drained from his body. His hands, which had been gripping the roof of my car, fell limp to his sides. That is the exact routing and account number for the offshore shell corporation you registered under Madison's maiden name in the Cayman Islands. I continued speaking slowly, so every single syllable could carve its way into his panicked brain. An account that is currently holding precisely $4,822,614.32. I watched the color completely drain from his face. The snowy night air was well below freezing, but a fresh bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, choking sound came out. You set up a fake vendor shell in Delaware, I explained, maintaining intense, unwavering eye contact. You invoiced your own startup for phantom server infrastructure costs and funneled the seed capital straight into that offshore account. On October 12th, you wired $600,000. On November 3rd, you wired another $1 million. You used that stolen capital to buy my father's affection. You used it to lease Madison's sports cars. You used it to buy the illusion of success. How? Jamal gasped, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the single word. How do you know those numbers? Those accounts are encrypted. They are buried behind layers of dummy corporations. I buy bad debt, Jamal, I replied, my tone devoid of any empathy. I do not just look at what people owe. I track exactly where the money went. When I find a leak, I follow the pipes. You thought you were a genius for moving money offshore, but you left digital fingerprints all over the wire transfers because you were too arrogant to hire a real financial cleaner. You left a trail a mile wide. Jamal took a physical step back, his legs visibly shaking. The intimidating, towering posture was completely broken. He looked exactly like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner's hand move toward the lever. He wrapped his arms around himself, suddenly violently aware of the freezing temperature. He began hyperventilating, his breath coming in short, ragged white clouds as the absolute reality of his destruction settled over him. I stepped forward, closing the distance he had just created. I raised my hand and firmly tapped my index finger twice against his chest, right over his racing heart. You do not have investors, Jamal, I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow to his ego. You have victims. And I own you. I turned my back on his gasping, trembling figure. I opened the heavy door to my Range Rover, slid into the heated leather seat, and started the engine. The powerful roar of the motor cut through the winter wind. I shifted the car into drive and pressed the gas pedal. As I pulled out of the circular driveway and headed down the dark, snow-covered street, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Jamal was still standing there in the freezing storm, clutching his chest, hyperventilating in the snow as his entire fraudulent empire crumbled to dust. The heated leather steering wheel of my Range Rover felt grounding beneath my bare hands. I turned the climate control onto maximum, letting the dry, hot air blast away the lingering chill of the Greenwich snowstorm and the toxic residue of my family's dining room. The heavy all-terrain tires crunched satisfyingly over the fresh powder as I navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of the ultra-wealthy neighborhood. These were the exact streets I was banished from 15 years ago, when I had nothing but a duffel bag and a shattered heart. Tonight, I was driving through them as an executioner. I tapped the touchscreen on my dashboard, bypassing the cheerful holiday music stations, and initiated a secure encrypted call. It rang exactly twice. My lead attorney, Victor, never slept when a major financial play was in motion. Tell me you did not actually eat the stuffing, Becca. Victor's voice filled the quiet cabin of the SUV, his tone crisp and alert despite the late hour. I hear Patricia uses canned broth and tries to pass it off as homemade. I barely survived the appetizers, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the icy road ahead. They served a healthy portion of delusion garnished with a physical assault. Madison slapped me. Richard threw me out into the snow. A sharp, aggressive intake of breath hissed through the car speakers. Assault. Do you want me to dispatch local law enforcement right now? We can have her arrested for battery before the dessert plates are even cleared from their table. No, I said, a genuine, chilling smile finally touching my lips in the darkness of the car. Handcuffs are entirely too temporary for what they deserve. I prefer permanent generational ruin. Give me the current status on the Greenwich portfolio. I heard the rapid, precise clacking of a mechanical keyboard on Victor's end. Pulling up the master file now. Your father truly is a spectacular study in financial incompetence. To maintain the illusion of being old money, Richard quietly leveraged the family estate to the absolute brink. 2 years ago, when Jamal's fake tech company needed quote-unquote seed capital to keep up appearances, Richard could not secure a traditional bank loan. His credit profile was already bleeding out from Patricia's exorbitant country club fees and Madison's luxury lifestyle. So he went to the shadow markets, I prompted, already knowing the answer but needing to hear the trap confirmed out loud. Exactly, Victor said, his tone dripping with professional disgust. He took out a massive predatory mezzanine loan from a secondary private equity group. $4.5 million. The terms were absolutely toxic, Becca. 18% interest. A balloon payment structure specifically designed to force an eventual default. And your father was arrogant enough to cross-collateralize it with everything he had left to his name. The house, the Mercedes G-Wagon, Madison's Porsche Cayenne, even Patricia's jewelry collection. He literally bet his entire existence on Jamal's startup going public and making him a billionaire. And the original lenders bundled that toxic debt and put it on the secondary market to offload the risk. I said, the heater finally warming the damp wine-soaked silk of my dress. Which is exactly where we swooped in, Victor confirmed, a hint of dark corporate triumph ringing in his voice. 6 months ago, our distressed debt fund utilized a blind proxy LLC to purchase that specific portfolio for pennies on the dollar. We acquired the paper, the liens, the collateral rights, everything. Richard thinks he owes money to a faceless corporate entity registered to a post office box in Delaware. He has absolutely no idea that his ultimate creditor, the entity holding the financial leash around his neck, is his own discarded daughter. I navigated a sharp turn, the heavy vehicle gripping the black ice flawlessly. Has he tried to make contact with the proxy servicer today? He has been calling the automated line non-stop since Monday morning, Victor chuckled softly, leaving desperate, sweaty voicemails. He has missed 3 consecutive monthly payments, Becca. He is completely tapped out of liquid cash. He keeps begging the automated machine for a forbearance, claiming his son-in-law is about to close a massive venture capital round that will clear the entire balance. He genuinely thinks he can charm his way out of a legally binding default. There is no venture capital round, I said flatly, my voice stripped of all empathy. Jamal is currently experiencing a total psychological collapse in the snow outside the estate. The fake money is gone. Richard has nothing left to leverage. Then the trap is officially set, Victor stated, shifting back to strict, ruthless legal protocol. The demand notices were properly served to his registered P.O. box 30 days ago. We have followed every single state and federal regulation regarding asset seizure to the letter. The paperwork is flawless, Becca. There are no loopholes. We just need the clock to run out. I glanced down at the glowing digital clock on the center console of my dashboard. The bright white numbers stared back at me in the dark cabin. 11:45 p.m. Thanksgiving Day was in its final death throes. The frenzied consumerist chaos of Black Friday was looming just beyond the horizon. The final grace period for his third missed payment. I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper as a heavy surge of adrenaline spiked through my veins. What is the exact expiration time? Midnight. Victor answered immediately, the sound of keyboard clicking stopping entirely. The contract specifically stipulates that the cure period expires at exactly 12:00 a.m. on the Friday following the Thanksgiving holiday. If the outstanding balance of $4.5 million is not wired into our holding account by the time that clock strikes 12, the loan goes into automatic irreversible default. The acceleration clause kicks in instantly. All collateral becomes our immediate legal property. 15 minutes. In exactly 15 minutes, the house where I was told I was useless, the dining room where I was humiliated, the driveway where I was banished, would legally belong to me. My father had spent 33 years building a kingdom of arrogance, entitlement, and exclusivity. I was about to repossess it before he even finished digesting his holiday meal. "Stand by, Victor," I said, my eyes fixed on the dark snow-swept road illuminated by my high beams. "Have the asset seizure teams and the process servers ready on a secure line. Nobody sleeps tonight." "Standing by," Victor confirmed smoothly. "It is your call, boss." I kept my foot steady on the accelerator. The dashboard clock clicked to 11:46 p.m. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. I navigated the icy, winding roads away from the sprawling Greenwich estates, eventually pulling the Range Rover onto a secluded, scenic overlook. Below me, the Hudson River churned like liquid obsidian, a dark void separating the quiet, insulated wealth of the suburbs from the towering electric grid of the Manhattan skyline. The city glowed against the dark winter sky, a sprawling monument to power and capital. That same skyline used to terrify me when I arrived there at 18, completely broke, shivering in a cheap coat after my parents drained my college fund. Back then, I was a victim. Now the city was my playground. I owned pieces of those steel and glass towers. I dictated the flow of capital that kept their lights on. And tonight, I was using that immense power to obliterate the very people who thought they had buried me. I put the car in park and kept the engine running, letting the heater blow dry, hot air through the cabin as the snow continued to fall violently outside. I glanced at the digital display on the dashboard. 11:50 p.m., 10 minutes left. I picked up my encrypted tablet from the passenger seat and opened the secure banking portal connected to my distressed debt fund. The interface was stark and minimalist, displaying a single massive liability account registered to Richard. The balance sat there in bright red, unforgiving numerals: $4.5 million. It was a staggering amount of negative leverage for a man who desperately pretended to be an untouchable aristocrat. I watched the seconds tick by, feeling a strange, hollow calmness settling deep in my chest. A weaker person might have felt a twinge of guilt. A traditional daughter might have picked up the phone, called her father, and offered him one final chance to negotiate, to apologize, to beg for a sliver of mercy. But Richard and Patricia had spent my entire life teaching me that mercy was nothing but a vulnerability. They had demonstrated just an hour ago that they would gladly throw me to the wolves to protect Madison and her fraudulent, silver-tongued husband. They had made their choices with absolute arrogance. Now they were going to choke on the severe, unyielding consequences. 11:55 p.m. I tapped my manicured fingernails rhythmically against the heated leather steering wheel. The snow thickened, masking the luxury homes behind me in a heavy blanket of white isolation. They were trapped in their mansion, completely unaware of the financial avalanche suspended right above their heads. 11:58 p.m. My phone screen lit up with an incoming secure call. It was Victor. I tapped the screen to answer, routing his voice through the SUV sound system. "We are at the wire, Becca," Victor said, his voice stripped of any casual banter. He was in full execution mode, now operating as the ruthless corporate attorney I paid handsomely to enact my exact will. "The automated clearinghouse system has run its final sweep for the day. Richard has not initiated any wire transfers. He has not posted a bond. He has not deposited a single cent into the holding account to cure the delinquency. The account remains severely delinquent." I kept my eyes locked on the dashboard clock. 11:59 p.m. The final 60 seconds stretched out taut and heavy with adrenaline. I did not blink. I did not take a single breath. I just watched the digital numbers prepare to shift. "He is banking on his status," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet car. "He thinks he can call the loan servicer on Monday morning, drop a few names, and charm his way out of a default. He thinks the rules do not apply to him because he lives in Greenwich." The rules of compound interest apply to everyone, Victor replied sharply. Midnight, 12:00 a.m. A sharp, high-pitched ping echoed through the cabin of my car from the tablet. A bright red automated alert flashed across the high-definition screen. Status update default confirmed. It is midnight, I announced, feeling a surge of pure, unfiltered power rush through my veins. The grace period is officially dead. Confirmed, Victor stated immediately, the rapid clicking of his keyboard returning. Richard is in total breach of contract. We are now legally authorized to execute the acceleration clause. This will demand the immediate total repayment of the $4.5 million principal, plus all accrued interest, default penalties, and legal fees. Do you want me to issue a standard 72-hour warning notice first, or do we go straight to the nuclear option? I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. No warnings, no grace periods, no courtesy calls. Trigger the acceleration clause immediately. I want the immediate freeze of all cross-collateralized assets. Lock down his checking accounts, his savings accounts, and his investment portfolios. Send the electronic seizure notices to his banks right now so he cannot wire a single dollar out of those accounts to hide it. File the emergency liens against the Greenwich estate and freeze the titles to both the Mercedes and the Porsche. Executing total asset freeze protocol, Victor confirmed smoothly. We are dropping a financial iron curtain over their entire existence. The banking algorithms will lock them out instantly. Any credit card tied to those accounts will trigger a hard decline code. They will be entirely cut off from their own capital by sunrise. Make it happen, I commanded. I pulled up the execution authorization file on my tablet. The legal document required one final digital signature from the fund manager to deploy the highly coordinated strike. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A green checkmark illuminated the screen, verifying my identity and locking my command into the system. The digital clock shifted to 12:01 a.m. I hit send. The transmission bar filled instantly, uploading the kill switch directly into the global banking network. The dominoes had officially begun to fall. Miles away inside the suffocating warmth of the Greenwich mansion, the reality of my digital strike had not yet materialized. The grand living room was a portrait of oblivious privilege. The massive stone fireplace crackled, casting a golden glow over the imported Italian leather sofas. Madison and Patricia had completely brushed off my departure. To them, my exit was just another dramatic tantrum from the jealous, bitter sister. They had quickly returned to their true passion, which was mindless, exorbitant consumption. Madison lounged horizontally across the sofa, resting her iPad on her pregnant belly. She was hyper-focused on the midnight Black Friday designer, drops her fingers flying across the glossy screen. She was building an online shopping cart that bordered on the obscene. A limited edition imported baby stroller worth more than a reliable used car. Matching rose gold Cartier watches for her and Jamal. A bespoke suite of European maternity wear. She was preparing to spend tens of thousands of dollars, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was currently outside in the freezing snow, experiencing a total psychological collapse. The digital clock on her screen shifted to 12:02. Madison casually tapped the checkout button, authorizing the massive charge to her American Express Centurion card. She expected the familiar, satisfying chime of a completed purchase. Instead, the screen loaded, the little circle spinning for a few seconds longer than usual. Then a sharp, aggressive red notification banner dropped down from the top of her iPad. Payment declined. Please contact your card issuer. Madison scoffed aloud, rolling her eyes at the inconvenience. She muttered a complaint about fraud protection algorithms being entirely too sensitive during holiday sales. Without a second thought, she reached into her designer wallet, pulled out a heavy platinum Visa, and rapidly typed in the secondary numbers. She hit submit again. Another spinning wheel. Another bright red banner. Transaction denied. Account frozen. Annoyance quickly shifted to genuine frustration. Madison kicked off her cashmere blanket and nudged our mother. She complained that the banking servers must be crashing from all the holiday traffic, blaming the digital bottleneck on the working-class masses fighting over discounted electronics. Patricia, eager to secure her own cart of marked-down Prada handbags and expensive skincare sets, waved her off with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Just use my card, sweetie," Patricia said, tapping the checkout button on her own device. Her screen froze for a fraction of a second, then violently rejected the transaction. Hard decline code. Patricia frowned, her perfectly manicured fingernail tapping the screen aggressively. She tried a different card, one linked directly to Richard's primary checking account. Declined. Insufficient funds or account suspended. The harsh uppercase words glared at them in the dimly lit living room, completely out of place in their world of endless capital. Patricia stood up, her expensive silk robe rustling against her ankles, and marched down the long carpeted hallway. She headed straight to Richard's ground-floor study, where he had retreated with a glass of bourbon after throwing me out into the blizzard. She burst through his heavy oak doors without knocking, demanding his physical wallet. She claimed the banks were experiencing a ridiculous holiday glitch, and she needed his direct corporate black card to bypass the system. Richard, exhausted and still nursing his bruised ego from our dinner confrontation, handed it over with a heavy grumble. He told her to hurry up and let him sleep. Patricia marched triumphantly back to the living room. She typed the elite corporate card details into the checkout portal and hit submit with absolute confidence. For a third time, the bright red error message illuminated her angry face. "Call your financial institution immediately." The arrogant, untouchable security of the Greenwich mansion began to rot from the inside out. Madison, breathing heavily now, tried to log directly into her mobile banking app to check her balances. The app refused her facial recognition. It threw up a stark white warning screen. "Access revoked. Please contact customer service regarding foreclosure and asset seizure proceedings." Madison dropped her phone onto the plush Persian rug, her hands suddenly trembling uncontrollably. Patricia stared at her own frozen screen, the horrifying realization slowly crawling up her spine. The banking glitch was not a glitch. The threats I had made in the grand foyer just an hour ago echoed loudly in her ears. By sunrise, not a single plate, not a single chair, and not a single brick in this house will belong to you. Back in my Range Rover, parked high above the Hudson River, the absolute silence of the night was broken by the aggressive, rapid ringing of my cell phone. The caller ID flashed brightly with my mother's name. I did not answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. Patricia was relentlessly blowing up my phone, her previous brutal declarations that I was dead to the family completely forgotten in the face of financial terror. After the fifth consecutive missed call, a notification popped up indicating a new voicemail. I connected the phone to the car's Bluetooth system and pressed play. I leaned back into my heated leather seat, ready to listen to the beautiful symphony of her panic. Patricia's voice blasted through the premium car speakers. It was shrill, unhinged, and completely stripped of all her refined upper-class polish. "Becca, you vindictive little witch!" Patricia screamed into the receiver, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I know you did something to our accounts. I know you hacked the bank. You work in finance. You manipulated the system just to ruin Madison's shopping because you are a jealous psycho. Turn the cards back on right now. Your father is calling the police. You are going to federal prison for cybercrime, do you hear me? Call me back and fix this immediately." I let the voicemail end. The quiet, peaceful silence returned to my car. Patricia still thought this was a petty prank. She still genuinely believed she held the moral high ground, that she could command me to fix a temporary inconvenience. She had absolutely no comprehension of the massive legal avalanche that was currently crushing her entire existence. I did not call her back. I did not send a defensive text message denying her ridiculous hacking accusations. Instead, I opened the family group chat. It was a digital space I had been forced to sit in for years, enduring their constant bragging and subtle daily insults. I copied a specific URL from my secure legal portal. I pasted that single link into the text box. I hit send, locked my phone screen, and tossed the device onto the passenger seat, letting the digital bomb detonate in the palm of their hands. I did not need to be standing inside the grand living room of the Greenwich mansion to know exactly how the digital detonation played out. The shockwave was a mathematical certainty. Inside the stifling warmth of the house, the synchronized chime of cell phones pierced the panicked atmosphere. Patricia, still breathing heavily from leaving her unhinged voicemails, snatched her phone from the coffee table. Madison, whose face was stained with mascara and frustration over her declined credit cards, leaned over her mother's shoulder. Richard, nursing his second glass of expensive bourbon by the fireplace, felt his own phone vibrate in the breast pocket of his trousers. He pulled the device out with a heavy sigh, expecting another angry text message from me complaining about my banishment. Instead, he saw a single raw web address glowing on his screen. It was a direct link to a government domain. Richard tapped the link. The Safari browser loaded for a fraction of a second before the official, unmistakable seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission materialized on his screen. It was an emergency asset freeze and cease and desist order. Richard squinted, his alcohol-laced brain struggling to process the dense federal legal jargon. He scrolled past the preliminary injunction warnings and landed directly on the summary of the enforcement action. The words on the glowing screen hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. Defendant Jamal, charge wire fraud, embezzlement, and operating an unregistered securities offering. Richard stopped breathing. The expensive bourbon sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his crystal glass. He swiped his thumb up the screen, his eyes scanning the horrifying details compiled by federal investigators. The document outlined a brazen, systematic Ponzi scheme. It detailed how Jamal had fabricated user acquisition metrics, falsified revenue reports, and funneled millions of dollars of investor capital into offshore shell companies hidden in the Cayman Islands. It explicitly confirmed the exact routing numbers and account balances I had recited to Jamal in the freezing driveway just minutes earlier. But the true fatal blow to my father's ego was buried in page 4 of the Asset Tracing Annex. Richard forced himself to read the paragraph detailing the flow of the most recent capital injection. The federal investigators had tracked a massive high-interest mezzanine loan of $4.5 million. The document listed the origin of that capital. It named the exact private equity firm Richard had quietly borrowed the money from. It named the Greenwich estate as the primary collateral. And then, in cold, undeniable federal print, it revealed exactly where Richard's borrowed money had gone. Jamal had not used a single cent of Richard's $4.5 million to build proprietary algorithms or secure a tech initial public offering. The SEC document traced the funds directly to the immediate repayment of early-stage defrauded investors to keep them quiet, alongside massive six-figure transfers to cover high-end luxury car leases, private jet charters, and exorbitant personal credit card bills. The money was gone. The realization crashed down on Richard, crushing the air out of his lungs. He had risked his home, his cars, his wife's jewelry, and his entire financial existence to fund the lifestyle of a parasite. He had banished his own daughter, the only person who had tried to warn him, the only person who had actually read the fraudulent balance sheets. And he had done it to protect a man who was actively stealing his home right out from under his feet. The heavy crystal bourbon glass slipped from Richard's trembling fingers. It plummeted to the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The amber liquid splashed across the polished wood and soaked into the fringe of the expensive Persian rug. Patricia jumped at the sudden noise, dropping her own phone onto the sofa. She stared at her husband in alarm. Richard's face had drained of all color, replacing his usual arrogant flush with a terrifying sickly gray. He did not say a word to his wife. He did not answer Madison when she demanded to know what the link meant. The sophisticated, upper-class patriarch was completely gone. In his place stood a ruined, desperate man who had just realized his entire kingdom was built on quicksand. Richard turned on his heel and marched out of the living room. His heavy footsteps pounded against the carpeted hallway, accelerating with every stride. He knew exactly where Jamal was. After I had left Jamal hyperventilating in the snow, the coward had slinked around to the side entrance of the mansion, bypassing the living room to avoid questions. Jamal had retreated to the first-floor guest suite, locking himself inside to panic in private. Richard reached the heavy oak door of the guest suite. He did not knock. He did not ask permission to enter. Lifting his leg, Richard drove the flat sole of his leather shoe directly into the wood, right next to the brass door handle. The door frame splintered violently with a loud crack, the metal lock giving way under the sheer force of his absolute rage. The door banged open, bouncing hard against the interior wall. Jamal flinched violently. He was standing near the foot of the king-sized bed, still wearing his soaked, freezing suit trousers, though he had discarded his ruined jacket. He was frantically stuffing a stack of customized passports, several expensive watches, and thick banded stacks of emergency cash into a designer leather duffel bag. He was attempting to flee before the federal agents arrived. Richard stepped over the splintered wood, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "You stole my house!" Richard roared, the sound tearing through the mansion like thunder. Jamal backed away, holding his hands up defensively, his charismatic smile replaced by pure cornered terror. He stammered, trying to deploy one last desperate lie, trying to claim the SEC document was a misunderstanding, a competitor's smear campaign, a temporary regulatory hurdle. Richard did not let him finish a single sentence. My father lunged across the bedroom. He grabbed Jamal by the collar of his wet, expensive dress shirt, twisting the fabric tightly in his fists. He slammed the younger, taller man backward into the heavy mahogany dresser. Framed photographs and decorative vases crashed to the floor, shattering glass across the expensive carpet. A vicious, uncontrolled physical fight broke out between the two men of the house. Jamal, desperate to escape federal prison, threw a panicked punch, catching Richard on the side of the jaw. But Richard possessed the terrifying adrenaline-fueled strength of a man who had just lost everything. He tackled Jamal to the floor, pinning him against the edge of the bed frame. In the hallway behind them, Patricia and Madison finally arrived at the shattered doorway. Patricia began screaming hysterically, clutching her face as she watched her husband and her beloved son-in-law brutally tearing each other apart. Madison shrieked, begging them to stop, her hands hovering protectively over her pregnant belly. But there was no stopping the violence. It was the physical manifestation of their financial ruin. The sophisticated, wealthy family image they had guarded so fiercely was dead, replaced by blood-shattered glass and absolute unforgiving betrayal. The physical fight was brutal, entirely stripped of the country club refinement my father had spent decades cultivating. Richard drove his knee into Jamal's ribs, pinning the younger man against the shattered remains of the mahogany dresser. Jamal swung blindly, his knuckles catching Richard on the cheekbone with a sickening thud. The two men crashed onto the expensive Turkish rug, knocking over a heavy brass floor lamp that smashed into the drywall. Patricia stood in the ruined doorway, clutching the sides of her face. She unleashed a piercing, hysterical scream, the kind of raw, unfiltered noise she would have previously deemed entirely too low class for a Greenwich neighborhood. She rushed forward, grabbing the back of Richard's ruined button-down shirt, desperately trying to pull him off her son-in-law. Madison did not try to stop the violence for the sake of peace. She threw herself into the fray purely to protect her fraudulent husband. She smacked her father repeatedly on the shoulder, screaming at the top of her lungs, her designer maternity dress tearing at the seam. "Get off of him! Get your hands off my husband!" Madison shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You are going to hurt the baby!" Richard shoved Madison aside just hard enough to get her out of his strike zone. He grabbed Jamal by the collar again, hauling the younger man halfway off the floor. Jamal was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, his expensive tailored shirt ripped open, revealing a heavy gold chain that Richard had undoubtedly paid for. "Where is my money?" Richard roared, shaking Jamal so violently the man's head snapped back and forth. $4.5 million. You told me it was secured in an escrow account for the initial public offering. The federal government says you wired it to the Cayman Islands. Tell me how to get it back right now or I will kill you myself. Jamal spat a mouthful of blood onto the ruined carpet. The charismatic tech visionary was dead, and the cornered street hustler finally emerged. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh, glaring up at the man who had bankrolled his entire fake empire. "You are an idiot!" "Richard?" Jamal gasped, coughing as he struggled to breathe under my father's weight. "You think that money is just sitting there waiting for you?" "I had early investors threatening to go to the authorities 6 months ago. I had to pay them off to keep the Ponzi scheme from collapsing. And the rest of it? Look around you, old man. Look at your daughter's wrists. Look at the cars in your driveway. You demanded I treat Madison like a queen to maintain your precious family image. You literally paid for your own fake lifestyle. Richard released Jamal's collar, stumbling backward as if he had been physically burned. He hit the wall and slid down his chest, heaving his eyes wide with a terrifying hollow realization. The millions he had secretly borrowed against the family estate, the predatory loan that was charging 18% interest, it was all gone. Vaporized to buy time and designer handbags. "This is Becca's fault," Madison screamed, kneeling beside Jamal and wiping the blood from his face with her bare hands. If she had just signed the guarantor paperwork at dinner, the new bridge loan would have cleared everything. Jamal could have fixed the company. She did this to us on purpose. She called the federal investigators just to ruin my life. Richard slowly turned his head to look at his favorite daughter. For the first time in 35 years, he looked at Madison not as his golden child, but as the spoiled, delusional parasite she truly was. "Shut up, Richard," whispered his voice, shaking with absolute venom. "Just shut your mouth, Madison. Your sister did not cause this. Your husband is a federal criminal, and you are a blind, greedy fool who bankrupted your own family." Patricia gasped, rushing to put a protective arm around Madison. "Richard, do not speak to her that way. She is pregnant. We need to figure out a plan. We need to hire lawyers. We need to move whatever cash we have left before the government freezes our personal accounts." The word cash seemed to jolt Richard back to reality. The Securities and Exchange Commission filing had only mentioned freezing Jamal's assets, but Richard knew how federal investigations worked. Once they realized Richard's borrowed funds were tied up in the fraud, they would subpoena his accounts next. He needed to transfer his remaining liquid capital, the last $200,000 he had sitting in his primary checking account, into an untouchable offshore trust he had set up years ago. He scrambled off the floor, ignoring the pain in his jaw and his bruised ribs. He stumbled past Patricia and Madison rushing out of the ruined guest suite and sprinting down the hallway back to his private study. He threw himself into his leather desk chair and slammed his hand against his computer mouse to wake up his monitors. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely type his password. He navigated to his elite banking portal, the one reserved for high-net-worth clients. He typed in his credentials and held his breath, waiting for the familiar interface to load. The screen flashed white. A loading circle spun for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the screen turned a stark, solid black. A single bright red notice appeared directly in the center of the monitor. "Account frozen. Pending foreclosure." Richard stared at the red letters, his brain refusing to process the words. Foreclosure. The bank did not freeze accounts for foreclosure without issuing 90 days of written warnings, default notices, and a massive legal battle. And the SEC did not execute foreclosures, they executed asset freezes. He frantically grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, opening his mobile banking app to try a different route. Face ID scanned his sweaty, bruised face. The exact same red text glared back at him from the palm of his hand. "Account frozen. Pending foreclosure." Then a secondary notification popped up on his screen. It was an automated email from the private equity firm that held his toxic mezzanine loan, the anonymous debt collectors he had been dodging all week. He opened the email with a trembling thumb. Notice of default and immediate acceleration. The document informed him that his grace period had officially expired at midnight. The creditor had exercised their legal right to accelerate the loan. The entire balance of $4.5 million was due immediately. Because he could not pay, the creditor had executed an emergency lien and frozen all cross-collateralized assets, his checking accounts, his savings, the equity in the house. Everything was locked. Richard dropped his phone. It clattered against the mahogany desk. Becca had not just been making a dramatic exit when she told him to enjoy the house, because it would not belong to him by sunrise. She had not been bluffing when she claimed she was his legal creditor. She had known about the loan. She had bought the loan. She was the anonymous entity choking the life out of him. She had deliberately waited until he threw her out into the cold to push the button that executed his total financial ruin. He sat in the dark study listening to the muffled sounds of his wife crying and his daughter arguing with her criminal husband down the hall. The reality of his absolute destruction settled heavily over his shoulders. He had absolutely nothing left. No money, no lawyers, no way out. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour. It was 4:30 in the morning. Richard stared blankly out the large bay windows of his study, watching the heavy snow continue to fall on the dark, quiet streets of Greenwich. The neighborhood was dead silent. Suddenly, the pristine white snow in the front yard was illuminated by a rapid strobing light. Brilliant flashes of bright red and piercing blue cut through the darkness of the winter morning, reflecting violently off the glass window panes and throwing chaotic-colored shadows across Richard's ruined face. Multiple heavy vehicle engines idled loudly right outside his front door. The heavy vehicle engines idled loudly outside the front door, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of the study. Richard stood frozen by the bay window, the alternating red and blue lights washing over his bruised face. For a brief, desperate second, his mind tried to rationalize the flashing lights. He convinced himself that a neighbor had called the local Greenwich precinct to file a noise complaint. The shattering glass and screaming from the guest suite must have echoed across the property line. A noise complaint was manageable. A noise complaint was something a man of his status could wave away with a firm handshake, a forced smile, and a generous donation to the Policeman Benevolent Association. Richard smoothed his trembling hands over the front of his torn, blood-stained dress shirt. He took a deep breath, forcing his chest to expand, attempting to summon the authoritative aura of the wealthy patriarch he had played for decades. He turned away from the window and marched back down the long hallway toward the grand foyer. Patricia and Madison were already standing at the edge of the living room, their faces illuminated by the frantic police lights strobing through the frosted glass of the front door. Patricia clutched her silk robe tightly to her throat, her eyes wide with mounting panic. Madison was hyperventilating, her hands protectively covering her stomach. Jamal was nowhere to be seen, having cowardly barricaded himself back inside the ruined guest bedroom the moment the sirens became audible. "Stay here and keep quiet," Richard barked at his wife and daughter, his voice laced with forced bravado. "It is just the local patrol. I will handle them. Do not say a single word about Jamal or the money." Richard stepped up to the massive double oak doors. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, stepping out onto the covered stone porch, ready to deliver his practiced, condescending charm. The freezing winter wind hit him instantly, but it was not the cold that made his breath catch in his throat. There was no lone patrol car parked in his driveway. The entire front lawn was swarming with law enforcement. 4 marked county sheriff cruisers formed a barricade across the entrance gates. 2 unmarked black SUVs sat idling directly in front of the porch. Standing at the bottom of his snowy steps was not a friendly local beat cop looking to issue a noise warning. Richard found himself staring down the county sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a face carved from stone. Flanking the sheriff were 2 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their chests. Standing slightly behind the wall of law enforcement was a sharp-suited, entirely calm process server holding a thick, heavy stack of manila legal folders. Richard gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. His practiced smile completely abandoned him. He opened his mouth, trying to deploy the only weapon he had left, his perceived social status. "Officers!" Richard began, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound commanding. "There is absolutely no need for this massive display. My family just had a minor private disagreement. We were handling it internally. I am personal friends with the police chief of this district. You are trespassing on private property." The county sheriff did not smile. He did not acknowledge the name drop. He looked at Richard with the cold, absolute indifference of a man who dealt with arrogant fallen executives every single day. "Secure the perimeter," the sheriff ordered, his deep voice cutting through the howling wind. "Agents, the primary suspect for the federal warrant is located inside the premises." The 2 armed FBI agents immediately marched up the stone steps, their boots crunching heavily on the ice. They shoved past Richard without a single word of apology, storming into the grand foyer. Patricia let out a blood-curdling shriek as the federal agents brushed past her, demanding to know the exact location of Jamal. Madison began sobbing hysterically, sinking to her knees on the marble floor as the heavy, aggressive footsteps of the agents echoed down the hallway toward the guest suite. Richard tried to turn around, tried to stop the agents from invading his home, but the county sheriff stepped up onto the porch, physically blocking Richard's path back inside. The sharp-suited process server stepped up beside the sheriff. He did not look intimidated by the massive mansion or the furious man standing in the doorway. He operated with the ruthless mechanical efficiency of the corporate machine. "Are you Richard?" The process server asked, his tone crisp and entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes, I am the owner of this house." Richard spat, his face flushing with fresh, panicked rage. "And I demand to know what gives you the right to tear my home apart at 4:30 in the morning on a holiday weekend." The process server did not engage with the outrage. He simply thrust the heavy stack of manila folders directly into Richard's chest. Richard instinctively raised his arms to catch the thick documents officially accepting service. "Richard, you are hereby served with an emergency writ of execution, an immediate asset seizure mandate, and a notice of foreclosure acceleration." The process server recited rapidly, reading from a prepared legal script. "These orders have been signed, expedited, and fully authorized by a federal judge due to the presence of cross-collateralized assets currently linked to an active federal wire fraud investigation." Richard looked down at the thick stack of papers in his trembling hands. The bold black ink on the top page seemed to burn into his retinas. He saw the exact loan numbers. He saw the list of his assets: the house, the cars, the bank accounts. Everything was documented, categorized, and legally stripped from his possession. And right there, listed under the primary creditor designation, was the corporate LLC that his discarded daughter controlled. Becca had not just frozen his accounts. She had utilized Jamal's federal fraud investigation as a legal catalyst to bypass every single standard foreclosure waiting period. Because Richard had used the house as collateral for the loan, and Jamal had used the house as a physical base of operations for his Ponzi scheme, the property was now officially classified as a compromised asset. Becca's legal team had convinced a judge that Richard was a massive flight risk who was actively destroying the value of the collateral. The judge had granted the emergency seizure order just hours ago. The absolute terrifying reality of his checkmate crashed over Richard. He was not just broke, he was legally evicted. "You cannot do this," Richard gasped, looking wildly from the documents to the sheriff. The freezing wind was tearing through his thin, bloody shirt, but he was sweating profusely. "This is my home. You cannot throw my family out into the snow in the middle of the night. We have rights. I demand to speak to a judge. I demand to call my attorneys." "Your assets are frozen, Richard," the process server stated coldly, stepping back out into the snow. "You do not have attorneys anymore." The county sheriff stepped fully into the foyer, his heavy boots tracking snow onto the pristine marble floor. He looked down at Richard with absolute chilling authority. "You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises. We are taking possession of the property on behalf of the creditor." The sheriff's words echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the grand foyer, hanging in the freezing air that swept through the open doorway. 30 minutes. The countdown struck Patricia with the force of a physical blow. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her throat as she collapsed against the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase. A harsh, ragged sound ripped from her chest as she began to hyperventilate. The immaculate society matron who had spent decades curating an image of absolute perfection was now gasping for air on her own floor, her silk robe pooling around her trembling knees. She clawed at her chest, her eyes darting wildly around the foyer, taking in the armed federal agents standing on her imported rugs. Richard remained utterly paralyzed in the doorway. He did not rush to comfort his wife. He did not demand the officers show him more respect. His gaze was fixed blindly on the snow-covered lawn, his mind completely shattered by the realization that his entire empire had been legally vaporized by the daughter he had banished just hours prior. Before the absolute silence of their ruin could fully settle, a new terrifying sound fractured the quiet winter morning. It was a deep mechanical roar. Heavy diesel engines rumbled down the pristine tree-lined street of the exclusive Greenwich neighborhood. The distinctive hiss of commercial air brakes echoed through the freezing air. Through the open front doors, Richard watched in fresh horror as two massive heavy-duty tow trucks backed aggressively through the wrought iron gates of the estate. Bright rotating amber lights flared atop the massive trucks, mixing chaotically with the red and blue police strobes already washing over the property. The repo men had arrived. Becca had not simply authorized a digital freeze on the bank accounts. She had ordered the immediate physical repossession of every single cross-collateralized asset tied to the defaulted loan. The financial execution was designed to leave no stone unturned. The two tow trucks maneuvered expertly into the wide, circular driveway, their heavy, studded tires crushing the immaculate landscaping. Two men wearing high-visibility winter jackets hopped down from the cabs. They carried heavy steel chains and hydraulic controls, moving with the practiced, ruthless efficiency of professionals who repossessed vehicles for a living. They did not care about the address. They did not care about the size of the mansion. They only cared about the VIN numbers, matching their digital seizure orders. One of the men walked directly toward the custom white Porsche Cayenne, parked near the garage. The other headed straight for Richard's matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. Inside the hallway, Madison heard the loud crunching of the tires and the heavy clanking of steel chains. She peeked around the corner of the foyer, her tear-streaked face pale with shock. When she saw the high-visibility jackets moving toward her luxury SUV, her fragile grip on reality completely snapped. That Porsche was her ultimate status symbol. It was the vehicle she drove to the country club to flaunt her wealth. It was her entire identity wrapped in German engineering. Madison let out a blood-curdling shriek. She shoved past her hyperventilating mother and bolted out the front door. She did not grab a coat. She did not put on shoes. She sprinted directly out into the brutal -3-degree blizzard, wearing nothing but her thin designer silk maternity pajamas and a pair of velvet house slippers. The freezing snow instantly soaked through the delicate velvet, soaking her bare feet in icy slush. But Madison did not even seem to register the pain. She threw her body between the repo man and the front grille of her Porsche. "Get away from my car!" Madison screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She swatted frantically at the repo man's heavy winter jacket. "Do you have any idea who I am? My husband is a billionaire tech CEO. You cannot touch this vehicle. It is fully paid off. I will have you fired and sued for everything you own." The repo man did not flinch. He did not argue. He simply looked at the screaming, silk-clad woman with the absolute indifference of a man holding a court-ordered mandate. He pulled a laminated document from his clipboard and held it up in the freezing wind. "Vehicle is registered to Richards Holding LLC, ma'am," the worker stated in a bored, monotone voice. "Title is frozen under a federal writ of execution. Step away from the machinery, or I will have the sheriff remove you for obstructing a legal recovery." "It is my car," Madison wailed, stomping her freezing foot in the snow, acting like a petulant toddler rather than a 35-year-old woman. "It is my baby's car. You are stealing from a pregnant woman. Dad, tell them to stop. Make them stop right now." Richard stood on the porch, a broken shell of a man. He watched the second repo worker drag a heavy steel hook underneath the chassis of his beloved Mercedes G-Wagon. The sickening metallic clank of the chain locking onto the front axle echoed across the driveway. The winch whined loudly, tightening the cable and lifting the front wheels of the aggressive luxury tank right off the icy pavement. Richard could not form a single word to defend his daughter. He had absolutely no power left to project. Madison spun around, realizing her father was useless. The front end of her white Porsche began to lift off the ground, the hydraulic lift groaning under the weight. She grabbed the steel cable with her bare hands, screaming at the top of her lungs, fighting a completely unwinnable battle against a hydraulic winch. The chaos outside drew the attention of the man hiding inside the ruined guest suite. Jamal had been cornered in the bedroom, listening to the federal agents systematically tearing through the house, searching for his financial documents and his hidden passports. When he heard Madison screaming about the cars, something inside his arrogant, desperate mind finally snapped. The cars were the last tangible proof of his fake success. Without the cars, without the mansion, he was nothing but a fraud waiting for a prison cell. Jamal burst through the shattered guest room door. He ignored the federal agents searching the adjacent study and sprinted directly through the grand foyer, leaping over Patricia, who was still sobbing on the floor. He charged out the front doors, his ripped, bloody dress shirt flapping wildly in the winter storm. He saw the repo man operating the hydraulic levers beside the Porsche. Pure, unfiltered panic overrode any remaining common sense. Jamal lunged at the blue-collar worker, grabbing the man by the collar of his high-visibility jacket and throwing a frantic, desperate punch. "Drop the car!" Jamal roared, his face twisted in feral rage. "Unhook the damn car right now!" It was the single worst mistake he could have possibly made. Law enforcement officers do not tolerate physical violence during an active asset seizure. They especially do not tolerate it from the primary suspect named on an interstate wire fraud warrant. The two FBI agents who had followed Jamal out of the house moved with terrifying tactical precision. They did not shout a warning. They did not ask him to calm down. Before Jamal could throw a second punch, the lead federal agent hit him like a freight train. The agent drove his shoulder directly into Jamal's back, wrapping his arms around the fake CEO's waist and lifting him clean off his expensive leather shoes. Jamal let out a startled gasp as he was thrown through the air. He slammed face first onto the brutal ice-covered concrete of the driveway. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs, driving his bruised cheekbone hard against the freezing slush. Before Jamal could even attempt to push himself up, the second agent dropped his full body weight onto Jamal's spine, driving a knee sharply between his shoulder blades. The heavy crunch of the tackle silenced Madison's screaming. She froze in absolute terror, watching her charismatic, untouchable husband eat the icy driveway, his arms forcefully yanked behind his back by the federal agents. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel ratcheting shut echoed through the freezing morning air. The federal agent locked the handcuffs tightly around Jamal's wrists, securing his arms firmly behind his back. Jamal squirmed against the icy concrete, letting out a pathetic, breathless whine as the agent hauled him roughly to his knees, then dragged him up to his feet. The custom-tailored dress shirt, which Jamal had worn like a billionaire's armor just hours earlier in my parents' dining room, was now torn, soaked in freezing slush and stained with his own blood. "Jamal Vance!" The lead FBI agent barked, his voice carrying absolute terrifying authority over the howling wind. "You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, embezzlement, and operating an unregistered securities offering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The Miranda rights hung in the air, a verbal death sentence to the fraudulent tech empire my family had worshipped. Jamal did not look defiant. He did not look like a visionary CEO plotting his sophisticated legal defense. He looked exactly like a cornered street hustler who had finally run out of runway. He hung his head, his chin resting against his chest, refusing to look at his wife or his father-in-law as the federal agents frog-marched him toward the back of a waiting armored SUV. He offered no resistance as they shoved him into the back seat, the heavy door slamming shut like a vault. Madison stood paralyzed in her soaking wet silk pajamas. The reality of the federal arrest simply could not penetrate the thick, protective bubble of entitlement she had lived inside for 35 years. Her brain fundamentally refused to process the image of her husband being hauled away like a common criminal. She had spent her entire life insulated by wealth, trained to believe that any problem could be solved by swiping a black card or dropping her father's name. She spun around, her bare, freezing feet slipping slightly on the ice. She locked her panicked eyes onto her father, who was still standing on the stone porch, a hollow, broken shell of a patriarch. "Dad, do something!" Madison shrieked, her voice cracking with desperate, unhinged entitlement. She ran toward the porch, her arms flailing wildly, her designer pajamas clinging to her shivering frame. "They are making a mistake. You know the police chief. You play golf with the federal judges. Call your lawyers right now. Tell them to bring the bail money. Jamal cannot go to a federal holding cell. I am pregnant. My baby needs its father. We have a reputation to maintain in this neighborhood. Pay the bail, Dad. Just pay the bail and get him out of that car. She grabbed the lapels of Richard's ruined shirt, shaking him as if she could physically force him back into the role of the all-powerful provider. She expected him to pull out his phone, dial a private fixer, and make the ugly reality disappear with a massive wire transfer. That was how their dynamic had always functioned. Madison created a mess, and Richard buried it under a mountain of cash to protect the family image. Richard stared down at his favorite daughter. He looked at her frantic, tear-streaked face, her ruined luxury sleepwear, and the bloated sense of superiority that he himself had cultivated within her since she was a child. He looked past her shoulder to the driveway where the repo men were currently chaining down the last tires of the Mercedes G-Wagon and the Porsche Cayenne. He heard the massive diesel engines revving, preparing to haul away the last physical symbols of his success. Something deep inside Richard's chest finally violently snapped. The dam holding back decades of enabling pride and financial desperation completely ruptured. With what money? Richard roared, the sheer volume of his voice startling the nearby law enforcement officers. Madison recoiled, dropping her hands from his shirt. She stared at him, her eyes wide with pure shock. Her father had never yelled at her. He had yelled at the staff. He had yelled at my mother. He had spent his entire life screaming at me, but he had never ever raised his voice at his golden child. Pay the bail, Richard mocked her, his voice dripping with concentrated venom. He stepped off the porch, advancing on Madison, forcing her to back up into the freezing snow. You want me to call my lawyers? I do not have any lawyers. I do not have a retainer. I do not have a single dollar left to my name. Your brilliant visionary husband stole everything. Do you hear me, Madison? He took my cash, he took my credit, and he took my house to pay off his fraudulent debts. Dad, stop it! Madison cried, covering her ears, completely incapable of handling accountability. You have emergency funds. You have the trust accounts. There are no trust accounts, Richard bellowed, his face turning an angry mottled purple. I mortgaged this entire estate to keep your fake, pathetic lifestyle afloat. I took a $4.5 million predatory loan so you could drive that Porsche and pretend you were a billionaire's wife, and Jamal wired every single cent of it to the Cayman Islands to cover his criminal tracks. The federal government just froze whatever pennies were left. We are bankrupt, Madison. We are homeless. We are completely, irreversibly ruined. Patricia, who had managed to crawl her way to the open front doorway, let out a loud, agonizing wail. She collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands as the absolute reality of their destitution set in. Richard did not stop. The golden child was finally facing the monster she had helped create. You stood in my dining room tonight and defended him, Richard sneered, pointing a trembling finger right between Madison's eyes. You slapped your sister across the face for trying to warn us. You begged me to sign away more money to that parasite sitting in the back of the federal cruiser. You are a blind, greedy, arrogant fool. You bankrupted your own family just so you could show off a designer baby stroller to your country club friends. I have nothing left to give you. Do not ever ask me for another dime. Madison sank to her knees in the freezing slush, clutching her stomach, weeping hysterically, as the reality of her shattered world finally crushed her. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her father had just verbally destroyed her. Her cars were chained to a tow truck. Her credit cards were frozen plastic rectangles. The violent storm began to break, the heavy snowfall finally tapering off into a light, icy drizzle. The digital clock inside the idling sheriff cruiser ticked over to exactly 6:00 a.m. On the eastern horizon, the first faint, pale streaks of morning light began to pierce the heavy winter darkness. The sun was rising over the frosted treeline of the Greenwich Estates, casting a cold blue glow across the chaotic, ruined driveway. Then the low, powerful purr of a pristine, high-performance engine broke through the sound of the sobbing women. A sleek black Range Rover pulled smoothly into the driveway, its heavy tires crunching loudly over the fresh snow. The sleek black vehicle glided to a halt, parking perfectly parallel to the heavily armed police barricade. The heavy doors unlocked with a crisp electronic beep that cut through the sounds of the idling tow trucks. The passenger side door opened first. My lead attorney, Victor, stepped out onto the icy driveway. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit and a long, heavy wool overcoat, clutching a fresh leather briefcase in his gloved hand. He did not spare a single glance for Madison, who was still weeping in the slush, or Patricia, who was hyperventilating on the porch. Victor walked straight up to the county sheriff. He unclasped his briefcase and handed over a sealed folder containing the finalized judge-signed execution orders. The sheriff opened the file, reviewed the primary creditor's signature, and gave Victor a firm, highly respectful nod. The law enforcement officers immediately stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea to create a clear, unobstructed path directly to the front porch of the mansion. Then the driver's side door opened. I stepped out into the freezing Greenwich morning. I was no longer wearing the wine-stained silk dress from the Thanksgiving dinner disaster. I had returned to my apartment, showered, and changed into my actual armor. I wore a tailored ivory cashmere turtleneck, immaculate black trousers, and a sweeping camel hair coat that fell perfectly past my knees. My hair was styled in a flawless, sleek blowout, completely untouched by the violent winter storm. In my right hand, I held a steaming cup of artisan black coffee. I looked exactly like what I was, a Wall Street predator arriving to inspect her newly acquired asset. I closed the heavy car door behind me. The crisp thud echoed across the silent, frozen lawn. Richard stared at me from the stone porch. His bloodshot eyes tracked Victor handing the final seizure documents to the federal agents. He watched the sheriff point respectfully in my direction, confirming who was in charge of the operation. The gears inside my father's panicked, exhausted mind finally caught traction. The horrific truth locked into place with devastating clarity. I had known the exact routing numbers for Jamal's offshore accounts. I had warned him that the house would be gone by sunrise. I had told him I bought bad debt for a living. The anonymous private equity group that purchased his toxic mezzanine loans 6 months ago was not some faceless corporate machine operating out of a Delaware post office box. It was my distressed debt fund. I was the puppet master who had quietly bought the financial leash around his neck, waited patiently for him to default, and then violently pulled it tight. His own discarded daughter was the primary creditor who had just legally evicted him. The last remaining shred of Richard's inflated aristocratic ego evaporated into the winter air. The wealthy patriarch who had spent his entire life looking down his nose at me simply ceased to exist. His legs gave out beneath him. Richard collapsed into the freezing, filthy slush of the driveway. The icy water soaked instantly through the knees of his expensive torn dress trousers. He did not try to stand back up. He dragged his body forward on his hands and knees, crawling over the frozen tire tracks left by the repo trucks. His bare, scraped hands slid against the harsh concrete as he dragged himself toward my feet. "Becca!" Richard wept, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch that barely sounded human. He scrambled toward my designer boots, completely ignoring the federal agents, the sheriff, and his hyperventilating wife. "Becca, please. Oh my God, please tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you can stop them from doing this." I stood perfectly still, letting the hot steam from my coffee curl into the freezing air. I looked down at the man who had banished me to the streets 15 years ago. "There is no mistake, Richard," I said, my voice as smooth and cold as the ice beneath his bleeding knees. The loan defaulted at midnight. The acceleration clause was triggered. The federal courts have granted full possession to the creditor. I own the house. I own the cars. I own the jewelry in the safe. I own every single thing inside those walls. Richard lunged forward and grabbed the hem of my camel hair coat. His bloody, trembling fingers left a faint, pathetic smudge on the pristine fabric. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to me. I am your father, Becca. We are blood. We are family. You cannot throw your own flesh and blood out into the snow like stray dogs." "You did it to me," I stated, simply, not raising my voice, not showing a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. "You threw me out when I was 18 with nothing but a duffel bag to pay for Madison's wedding. You threw me out tonight because I refused to fund a criminal. You only remember that we are blood when your bank accounts are completely empty." "I was wrong," Richard sobbed, bowing his head until his forehead rested directly on the icy toe of my leather boot. He was fully debasing himself in front of the entire neighborhood, the police, and his own ruined family. "I was a blind fool. Jamal manipulated us. Madison blinded me with her demands. They used me, Becca. I see that now. They are parasites. But you are brilliant. You are a genius. You are exactly the daughter I always wanted. You proved it today. You won. Just please call off the sheriff. Give me 30 days to find the money. I will sign anything you want. I will give you whatever you ask for. Just do not let them take my home. Patricia let out a horrified gasp from the porch, her hands flying to her mouth. Richard, have you lost your mind? Get up off the ground right now. Richard ignored his wife entirely. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, dirt, and blood. He was actively throwing his golden child and his loyal wife directly under the bus, hoping to save his own skin. He had absolutely no loyalty to anyone but himself. I will kick them out, Richard pleaded, pointing a shaking finger at Madison, who was still kneeling in the snow beside the tow truck. I will throw Madison out right now. I will divorce Patricia and leave her with nothing. I will do whatever it takes to make this right. Just please, Becca, have mercy on your old man. I looked over at Madison. The golden child was staring at her father in absolute heartbroken horror. The man who had enabled her worst behavior, who had shielded her from every consequence her entire life, was now begging to trade her homelessness for a warm bed. I turned my gaze back down to Richard. I did not step away from him. I did not pull my coat from his desperate grip. I simply brought my coffee cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast was perfectly bitter and wonderfully hot. You told me to get out and never come back. I said, my words dropping like heavy stones into the freezing morning air. I am just following the first half of your orders. Your 30 minutes are up. The sheriff stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching against the ice. He grabbed Richard by the bicep, hauling the weeping patriarch away from my camel hair coat with rough, uncompromising force. Richard stumbled his legs, refusing to support his weight, leaving a pathetic trail of bloody slush where he had been groveling. Patricia watched from the shattered doorway. She watched the absolute destruction of her husband's dignity. She saw the federal agents flanking the process server, completely unmoved by Richard's tears. She realized in a fraction of a second that her wealth was truly gone. The legal maneuvers had failed. The begging had failed. The eviction was actively happening. But Patricia had survived in high society for decades by mastering the art of manipulation. She knew the only thing that could halt a law enforcement operation was an immediate life-threatening medical emergency. She needed to stop the clock. She needed to buy time to get into a luxury hospital suite where she could hide behind doctors stalling the asset seizure while she figured out a plan. Patricia let out a sudden, strangled gasp that echoed loudly across the freezing lawn. She staggered forward, stepping off the covered porch and plunging her bare, manicured feet directly into the deep snow. She grabbed the left side of her chest, twisting her fingers violently into the silk fabric of her expensive robe. Her face contorted into a mask of pure agony. She collapsed onto the icy grass, her knees hitting the frozen earth hard. She arched her back, letting out a series of high-pitched, breathless wheezes, thrashing dramatically in the snow. Madison abandoned her impounded Porsche in an instant. She scrambled across the slippery driveway, her velvet slippers completely ruined, and threw her body over her mother. "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" Madison shrieked, her voice tearing through the quiet winter morning. She looked up at me, her face twisted in absolute feral hatred. "You are killing her. The stress of this illegal eviction is giving her a massive heart attack. She cannot breathe. If she dies right here in the snow, it is entirely on your hands, you sociopath." The dramatic performance had its intended effect on the authorities. The federal agents instinctively stepped back, trained to pause operations during a severe medical crisis. The sheriff reached for the heavy black radio clipped to his tactical vest, preparing to call dispatch for an emergency medical unit. This was the exact loophole Patricia was counting on. A trip to the elite private cardiac wing of the Greenwich Medical Center, a week of bed rest in a VIP suite while her lawyers untangled the mess. I did not panic. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of concern for the woman writhing in the snow at my feet. I held up my gloved hand, signaling the sheriff to stop. "Allow me, officer," I said, my voice completely devoid of any alarm. "She is my mother. I will handle the emergency response. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and pulled out my smartphone. I did not rush. I deliberately took my time unlocking the screen. I tapped the numbers 911 and pressed the speakerphone button, holding the device out so the audio would broadcast clearly across the freezing driveway. The emergency dispatcher answered immediately, her professional voice cutting through Madison's hysterical crying. 911, what is your emergency? Yes, good morning, I replied, speaking with the calm, flat cadence of a woman ordering a morning coffee. I need an ambulance dispatched to a residence in Greenwich. I clearly recited the address of the estate. We have a female in her 60s claiming to experience severe chest pains and shortness of breath. It appears to be a suspected cardiac event. Madison glared up at me, screaming over the speakerphone. Tell them to hurry! She is turning pale! Tell them to call ahead to the Mount Sinai Private Cardiovascular Wing. Dr. Evans is her personal cardiologist. The dispatcher heard the screaming in the background and typed rapidly. Understood, ma'am. Paramedics are en route. Due to the location, they will likely transport the patient to the Greenwich Private Medical Center. Are there any specific medical instructions the responders should be aware of? I stepped closer to Patricia. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her chest heaving dramatically as she maintained her theatrical performance. I made sure I was standing directly over her before I spoke back into the phone. Actually, there is a highly specific instruction regarding her transport, I said, my voice echoing coldly over the speakerphone. Please explicitly direct the responding paramedics to bypass any private clinics. The patient must be transported strictly to the County General Public Hospital downtown. Do not send her to Mount Sinai or Greenwich Medical. The dispatcher paused, clearly confused by the request coming from one of the wealthiest zip codes in the state. Ma'am, County General is a public trauma center. If the patient has premium insurance, the private facilities are much closer and better equipped for rapid cardiac triage. I looked directly down at Patricia's trembling eyelids. The patient no longer has premium health insurance, I stated, delivering the absolute brutal truth with surgical precision. Her top-tier medical policy was directly tied to a corporate holding account that has been completely liquidated and frozen under a federal fraud investigation as of midnight. She is entirely uninsured and completely insolvent. She has absolutely zero financial assets to her name. If you send her to a private clinic, they will refuse admission the second her financial background check bounces. She will have to go to the public emergency room and wait in the general triage line with the rest of the uninsured population. The effect of my words was instantaneous. It was nothing short of a medical miracle. The prospect of sitting for 12 hours in a crowded, underfunded public emergency room lobby, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the working-class people she had spent her entire life despising, was infinitely more terrifying to Patricia than losing her mansion. The dramatic, breathless wheezing stopped mid-gasp. The desperate clutching at her chest vanished. Her hands uncurled from her silk robe. Patricia opened her eyes, perfectly healthy, and sat straight up in the freezing snow. She brushed the icy slush off her expensive pajamas and glared up at me with unfiltered, murderous hatred. The fake heart attack was completely cured. Cancel the ambulance, Patricia snapped, her voice sharp, clear, and completely devoid of any medical distress. I smiled down at her, meeting her furious gaze. Cancel the ambulance, I repeated to the dispatcher. It appears the patient has made a miraculous and spontaneous recovery. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my coat pocket. I looked at the sheriff, who was staring at Patricia with absolute disgust, recognizing the manipulative stunt for exactly what it was. Her heart is perfectly fine, I said to the officers, taking another calm sip of my coffee. Proceed with the eviction. The federal agents immediately resumed their positions, marching past Patricia's shivering form and heading straight into the grand foyer to secure the perimeter. The sheer volume of the morning chaos had finally breached the insulated, soundproofed walls of the surrounding estates. Between the roar of the diesel tow trucks, the flashing emergency strobes, Jamal being tackled to the concrete, and Patricia's theatrical screaming, the pristine, enforced silence of the elite Greenwich neighborhood had been utterly shattered. Across the wide, snow-covered street, massive iron gates hummed open. Heavy oak front doors swung wide. The absolute worst nightmare of my parents was materializing right before their eyes in the cold light of dawn. Their neighbors were waking up. These were not average bystanders. These were the titans of industry, the hedge fund managers, the country club, board members, and the elite socialites that Richard and Patricia had spent 3 decades aggressively trying to impress. They stepped out onto their sprawling colonnaded porches, wrapped in thick cashmere robes and expensive winter coats. Directly across the street, the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company stood on his driveway, holding a mug of tea, watching the spectacle with undisguised fascination. Next door, the chairwoman of the annual charity gala, a woman my mother had desperately brown-nosed for years to get on the steering committee, was leaning over her stone balcony. And they were not just watching, they were holding up their smartphones. The bright, sharp flashes of camera lenses pierced the morning twilight. They were recording the entire raid. They were filming the federal agents hauling boxes of evidence out of the house. They were filming the tow trucks chaining up the Mercedes and the Porsche. And most devastatingly, they were filming Richard and Patricia kneeling in the filthy, freezing slush of their own driveway, completely stripped of their wealth and dignity. The social execution was absolute. Richard looked up from the ice and saw the glowing screens of the smartphones pointed directly at his ruined face. The financial destruction had broken his spirit, but this public humiliation utterly destroyed his soul. For a narcissist who had built his entire identity on the perception of superiority, being recorded as a destitute fraud by his own peers was a fate far worse than death. He scrambled backward like a frightened animal trying to hide behind the thick stone pillars of the porch. He threw his frozen, bleeding hands over his face, attempting to shield himself from the camera lenses. He whimpered a hollow, broken sound, completely paralyzed by the shame of his public exposure. Patricia crawled toward the hedges, wrapping her soaked, mud-stained silk robe tightly around her shivering shoulders, desperately trying to hide her face from the very women she had bragged to just yesterday. While her parents wallowed in the paralyzing agony of their destroyed social standing, Madison experienced a very different reaction. The golden child possessed a deeply ingrained, feral instinct for pure greed. Seeing her father broken and her mother humiliated did not trigger any sense of familial loyalty or grief in her. It triggered a ruthless survival mechanism. She realized with absolute certainty that the ship was sinking to the bottom of the ocean, and her only thought was how much treasure she could stuff into her pockets before the water took her under. While the federal agents were distracted with securing the second floor of the mansion, and while I was watching Richard cower from the neighbors, Madison quietly backed away from the porch. She slipped into the shadows of the grand foyer, disappearing into the chaotic interior of the house. I took another slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I did not need to chase her. I simply gave a subtle, silent nod to my lead attorney. Victor, who had been standing like a sentinel near the edge of the driveway, adjusted his wool overcoat and tracked Madison's trajectory. He moved with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a corporate shark. 5 minutes later, Madison re-emerged from the side door of the mansion, hoping to bypass the police barricade at the front entrance. She was practically sprinting down the icy flagstone path that led toward the street, keeping her head down to blend into the shadows of the tall, manicured privacy hedges. Tucked tightly under her arm, pressed hard against her pregnant belly, was a massive matte black crocodile skin Hermes Birkin bag. It was the crown jewel of her designer collection, a bag that retailed for more than most people made in a year. But it was not hanging gracefully from her forearm like a luxury accessory. She was clutching it like a duffel bag. The heavy leather seams were bulging outward in an unnatural, distorted shape. The top flap of the bag was strained to its absolute limit, unable to clasp shut, because the interior was stuffed to the point of bursting. Madison thought she had found a blind spot in the perimeter. She thought her status as a pregnant woman would make her invisible to the tactical teams securing the property. She reached the end of the stone path, stepping out toward the street, ready to hail a cab and vanish with her looted treasure. Victor stepped out from behind the tall hedges, moving directly into her path. He stood perfectly square, blocking her escape route to the street. He did not say a word at first. He just looked down at her with the cold, unyielding gaze of a man who seized assets for a living. Madison gasped, stumbling backward on the icy pavement. She pulled the bulging Birkin bag even tighter against her chest, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the crocodile leather handles. She tried to shoulder past him, instantly deploying her usual entitled aggressive attitude. "Get out of my way!" Madison hissed, her voice trembling with panic and rage. She tried to step to the left, but Victor mirrored her movement, effortlessly blocking the path. "I am pregnant, I am freezing, and I am leaving this property. You cannot legally hold me here. This is my personal handbag. Step aside before I press charges for harassment." Victor did not flinch. He did not yield a single inch of ground. He reached out with his gloved hand and firmly clamped his fingers around the thick leather handle of the Birkin bag. His grip was absolute steel. Madison tried to yank the bag away, but Victor's arm did not even move. The standoff froze them in place on the snowy path. "Open it!" Victor commanded, his voice sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of negotiation. "Every asset inside this house is now collateral." Madison dug her manicured nails into the crocodile leather, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. She yanked backward with all her remaining strength, but she was fighting a man who orchestrated hostile takeovers for a living. Victor did not engage in a tug of war. He simply twisted his wrist, applying sharp, calculated torque to the handle of the overloaded bag. The strained golden clasp, already pushed to its absolute limit by the sheer volume of looted goods stuffed inside, snapped open with a sharp metallic crack. Victor stepped to the side and aggressively ripped the bottom of the bag upward. Madison screamed as her prized Birkin was inverted. The contents did not just fall out. They cascaded into the dirty, freezing slush of the driveway in a heavy, glittering waterfall of absolute desperation. The snow was instantly covered in the remnants of Richard and Patricia's fraudulent empire. Thick rubber-banded stacks of emergency $100 bills hit the ice with heavy thuds. Velvet jewelry boxes tumbled open, spilling heavy diamond tennis bracelets, emerald necklaces, and Patricia's treasured vintage pearl chokers into the mud. Half a dozen solid gold Rolex watches, the ones Richard kept locked in his biometric wall safe, clattered harshly against the freezing concrete. Madison had not just been trying to save her own designer maternity wear. The golden child, realizing the ship was sinking, had sprinted straight to her parents' private safe and completely cleared it out. She had actively tried to rob her own mother and father blind to fund her escape. Richard and Patricia, who had been shivering near the front porch under the watchful eyes of the federal agents, heard the clatter of heavy gold hitting the pavement. They turned their heads, their eyes widening in fresh absolute horror as they recognized their most prized possessions scattered in the snow at their daughter's feet. "My grandmother's necklace!" Patricia gasped, her voice trembling as she pointed a shaking finger at the pearls sinking into the gray slush. She looked at her favorite daughter as if staring at a stranger. "Madison, you broke into our safe. While your father was being evicted, you were stealing our last emergency funds." Madison dropped the empty Birkin bag. She fell to her knees in the freezing mud, frantically clawing at the icy snow, trying to scoop up the scattered stacks of wet cash and shove them into the pockets of her silk pajamas. "It is my inheritance!" she shrieked, her voice completely unhinged. "You promised me this money, Dad. You said I would never have to struggle. I need this for the baby. Jamal is gone. I need the cash." The county sheriff, who had been monitoring the perimeter, marched heavily down the stone pathway. He did not ask her to stop. He reached down, grabbed Madison by the back of her silk collar, and hoisted her roughly to her feet. "Step away from the seized assets right now," the sheriff commanded, his voice booming with absolute unforgiving authority. "Every single item on the ground is now the legal property of the primary creditor. If you attempt to conceal or remove one more dollar bill from this property, I will place you in handcuffs for grand larceny and obstruction of justice." Madison froze, her wet hands hovering over a glittering Rolex. She looked up at the sheriff, then over at the federal agents who were currently shoving her husband into the back of a transport vehicle. The sheer terrifying reality of federal prison finally pierced her delusion. She slowly stood up, stepping back from the pile of looted wealth, sobbing uncontrollably into her freezing hands. Victor signaled to one of the process servers waiting near the porch. The young man walked forward carrying a standard cardboard box of heavy-duty black plastic construction trash bags. He snapped 3 of the large bags off the roll, the thick plastic rustling loudly in the quiet winter morning. Victor took the bags and walked up the stone steps. He handed one directly to Richard, one to Patricia, and threw the third one into the snow at Madison's feet. "You have exactly 5 minutes to re-enter the premises under armed escort," Victor announced, projecting his voice so the entire ruined family could hear their final terms. "You may gather essential non-luxury clothing. You may gather basic toiletries and required prescription medications. You are strictly forbidden from packing electronics, designer accessories, jewelry artwork, or financial documents. If you attempt to hide any high-value collateral in these bags, you will be arrested for theft. When your 5 minutes are up, you will walk out of those doors, and you will never step foot on this property again." Patricia stared at the cheap black plastic bag in her trembling hands. The woman who had spent 30 years organizing charity galas and bragging about her imported Italian luggage was now being ordered to pack her entire existence into a garbage bag. She looked at Richard silently, begging him to fix it, to find a loophole to wake her up from this nightmare. Richard did not look at her. He took his black trash bag, his shoulders slumping in total irreversible defeat, and shuffled through the shattered doorway of his former mansion, flanked heavily by an armed federal agent. The next 5 minutes were a masterclass in psychological devastation. Through the large bay windows, the neighbors watched as the wealthy, arrogant family scrambled frantically through their own home like common looters. They stuffed wool sweaters, socks, and basic winter coats into the black plastic. Madison wept hysterically as an agent forced her to leave her massive collection of designer shoes behind. Patricia hyperventilated as she bypassed her walk-in closet of fur coats, grabbing only a pair of sweatpants and a heavy winter parka. Exactly 5 minutes later, the sheriff ordered them out. They marched out onto the front porch. The contrast was staggering. Just yesterday, they had stood on this very porch, radiating wealth, power, and untouchable arrogance. Now they stood shivering in the biting wind, their hair disheveled, their faces bruised and stained with tears, each clutching a single black garbage bag filled with cheap clothing. They looked exactly like what they were: bankrupt, evicted, and utterly ruined. I stood at the base of the stone steps, my camel hair coat perfectly pristine, sipping the last warm drop of my coffee. I watched them trudge heavily down the icy path toward the street edge, entirely stripped to the bone. They had no cars, they had no cash, they had absolutely nowhere to go. I stepped up onto the expansive stone porch of my newly acquired multi-million-dollar asset. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the encrypted smart home application that my tech team had forcibly bypassed and seized from Richard's server just moments ago. The heavy custom oak front door stood wide open, the cold wind blowing through the grand foyer. The digital keypad mounted on the stone wall next to the door was flashing a steady, angry red, completely locked out of its original network. I tapped a sequence of commands into my phone. I initiated the master system override. A sharp electronic beep echoed across the porch. The digital keypad instantly stopped flashing red. It shifted to a bright, solid, vibrant green, signaling that the entire estate had just recalibrated to my exclusive master code. I looked over my shoulder. Richard, Patricia, and Madison were standing on the icy curb next to the street, clutching their garbage bags, watching me. Their faces were portraits of absolute agonizing despair. I did not wave. I did not smile. I simply reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I pulled the massive oak door shut. The heavy steel deadbolts engaged automatically with a loud mechanical and deeply satisfying click, permanently locking my family out in the cold. The heavy steel deadbolts engaging sent a final resonating echo across the frosted lawn. I turned away from the massive oak door of my new property, pulling the collar of my camel hair coat tighter against the biting winter wind. I took my time walking down the icy flagstone path, my leather boots finding secure footing where my family had slipped and stumbled just moments before. I passed my lead attorney, Victor, who offered a brief, satisfied nod before heading toward his own vehicle. At the edge of the driveway, the federal agents were concluding their business with Jamal. The aggressive swagger that had defined my brother-in-law was entirely absent. The sharp, tailored lines of his expensive suit were destroyed, the fabric torn and stained with blood from his brawl with Richard. The heavy metal handcuffs severely restricted his movements as an agent pressed a hand onto his head, forcing him to duck into the back of the dark federal cruiser. Jamal tried to crane his neck, searching the snowy curb for Madison, perhaps hoping for one last display of wifely devotion. Madison did not even look at him. She sat on the icy concrete curb, her arms wrapped tightly around her shivering frame, completely abandoning the man who had promised her a billionaire lifestyle. The heavy door of the federal cruiser slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud, sealing Jamal inside the mobile cage. The driver shifted into gear, the tires crunching over the salt and snow as the vehicle carried the fraudulent tech executive away toward a federal holding facility. Simultaneously, the two massive diesel tow trucks shifted their heavy gears. Black exhaust plumed into the pale morning sky as the drivers navigated the wide circular driveway. The heavy steel chains clanked loudly against the undercarriages of the seized luxury vehicles. I stood by the door of my Range Rover and watched the bright white Porsche Cayenne and the matte black Mercedes G-Wagon get hauled unceremoniously down the street. The amber rotation lights flared against the snowy tree branches, fading slowly into the distance, until the roaring engines became nothing but a quiet hum. The driveway was now entirely empty, stripped of every single status symbol my parents and sister had worshipped. I turned my attention to the curb. Richard, Patricia, and Madison were huddled together on the frozen concrete, surrounded by the remnants of the brutal winter storm. They had been reduced to sitting directly on their cheap black plastic trash bags to keep their bare skin off the freezing ice. Richard stared blankly at his scraped, bleeding hands, his jaw bruised and swollen from the fight with Jamal. The patriarch who had ruled his household with iron-fisted arrogance was completely hollowed out. Patricia was shivering violently in her mismatched sweatpants and heavy parka, her perfectly highlighted hair plastered to her wet forehead. She kept looking up and down the wealthy street, terrified that the neighbors might still be watching her ultimate degradation from their warm, luxurious porches. Madison sat curled into a tight ball, her ruined velvet slippers soaking in a puddle of freezing slush, her face buried in her knees as she wept with loud, ragged gasps. They were entirely isolated. No friends were coming to rescue them. No high-priced fixers were answering their calls. They had no cash to hail a taxi and nowhere to go even if they could afford the fare. I opened the heavy door of my Range Rover and climbed into the driver's seat. The heated leather embraced me instantly, pushing away the sharp winter chill. I started the engine, the powerful motor humming smoothly to life. I shifted the vehicle into drive and let the tires roll slowly over the fresh snow, guiding the large SUV toward the street edge. I pulled the car right alongside the curb where my family sat shivering on their garbage bags. I brought the vehicle to a complete stop and pressed the button to roll down the passenger side window. The tinted glass slid down smoothly, releasing a blast of warm, climate-controlled air from my cabin directly into the freezing morning wind. Patricia lifted her head, her face pale and streaked with dirt and ruined makeup. Her eyes darted wildly, searching my face for a single ounce of the submissive, desperate daughter she had banished years ago. She found absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating professional, her pride finally shattered under the weight of her immediate survival instincts. She crawled forward slightly, her hands gripping the edges of her black trash bag. "Becca, please!" Patricia cried out, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered desperation. The frosty air turned her ragged breath into white clouds. "Where are we supposed to go?" I leaned across the center console, resting my arm casually against the passenger seat. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, the woman who had allowed my father to throw me out into the snow to protect a fraud. I offered her a bright, completely genuine smile. "Try a homeless shelter," I said, my voice crisp and cheerful, cutting right through the miserable winter wind. "I hear they serve great turkey on Thanksgiving." I did not wait for her reaction. I did not care to see the fresh wave of horror wash over her face. I pressed the button to roll the tinted window back up, sealing off the freezing air and the pathetic sounds of my family weeping on the curb. I pressed my foot firmly onto the accelerator. The Range Rover surged forward, leaving Richard, Patricia, and Madison completely abandoned in the snow, surrounded by the icy wreckage of their own making. 3 months later, the brutal winter storms had long since melted away, replaced by the crisp, biting winds of early spring in Manhattan. I sat at the head of a massive polished glass conference table in my midtown office, finalizing the quarterly reports for my distressed debt fund. The aggressive acquisition of Richard's loan portfolio had yielded a phenomenal return on investment, solidifying my firm's reputation as a ruthless entity in the secondary market. The financial world praised my tactical brilliance, entirely unaware of the deep personal history tied to that specific ledger. My assistant stepped into the boardroom, handing me a freshly printed legal brief. I scanned the top sheet, my eyes catching the updated docket numbers for the Federal Circuit Court. The wheels of justice moved slowly, but they moved with absolute certainty. Jamal was currently sitting in a maximum security detention center, his request for bail denied a second time due to extreme flight risk. The federal prosecutors had uncovered even more offshore accounts, guaranteeing that his upcoming trial would end in a lengthy, devastating prison sentence. I signed the bottom of the brief and handed it back to my assistant, my mind shifting seamlessly to my afternoon schedule. The legal briefs on my desk painted a vivid picture of absolute devastation. Jamal was not just denied bail. He was actively negotiating a plea deal that would guarantee him a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The prosecutors had seized every hidden account, leaving him to rot in a concrete holding cell without a single dime for commissary snacks or a private defense attorney. Richard and Patricia were faring even worse out in the real world. The foreclosure of the Greenwich estate did not magically erase their financial obligations. The deficiency judgments from their various defaulted credit lines meant that any legally earned income was instantly garnished by multiple creditors. The former country club elites were now renting a tiny roach-infested studio apartment deep in a forgotten industrial sector of Queens. Richard, a man who used to scream at financial advisors over minor portfolio dips, was now working the graveyard shift stocking heavy inventory at a big box retail store. His knees were failing, his pride was entirely broken, and his minimum wage paycheck was devoured by taxes and debt collectors before it even printed. Patricia fared no better. The woman who once spent $10,000 on a single weekend spa retreat now spent 8 hours a day standing on her swollen feet, folding cheap synthetic sweaters at a discount clothing outlet. Her hands were calloused, her social circle had completely evaporated, and her former bridge club friends pretended they did not know her when they accidentally crossed paths. They had nothing left but their resentment and the miserable cramped walls of their apartment. But the most poetic execution of karma belonged to Madison. The golden child was currently in her third trimester, heavily pregnant and completely abandoned. When the federal agents hauled Jamal away, Madison had immediately filed for divorce, desperately hoping to sever herself from his criminal liability and shield whatever hidden cash she thought she could salvage. It was a spectacular failure. The government seized her frozen bank accounts, liquidated her jewelry, and flagged her social security number. Stripped of her fraudulent wealth and her enabling parents, Madison faced the ultimate terror for a spoiled socialite. She actually had to get a job. Lacking any real-world skills, a college degree, or a basic work ethic, her employment options were severely limited. She was forced to take a job as a waitress at an upscale, hyper-exclusive French bistro in the heart of Manhattan. It was the exact type of pretentious, overpriced establishment where she used to spend her afternoons aggressively snapping her manicured fingers at the service staff, complaining about the temperature of her sparkling water, and leaving insulting $0 tips. Now, she was the one wearing the stained apron, forced to smile and bow her head to wealthy patrons who looked right through her. I stepped out of my sleek black car and handed the keys to the valet standing in front of that exact French bistro. I had not picked the restaurant to torture my sister. My newest client, a ruthless real estate developer, had chosen the location for our introductory lunch. The universe simply possessed a phenomenal razor-sharp sense of irony. I walked through the heavy glass doors, the warmth of the bustling restaurant enveloping me. I wore a sharp-tailored navy blue power suit, my heels clicking confidently against the polished mosaic floor. The maitre d' greeted me immediately, recognizing my name from the exclusive reservation list, and escorted me to a prime corner booth bathed in natural light. My client was running 10 minutes late, which gave me a moment to sip my sparkling water and review my digital portfolio on my tablet. The ambient noise of clinking silver and wealthy chatter filled the room. I kept my eyes on my screen focused entirely on the upcoming negotiation. I heard the soft, hesitant scuff of rubber-soled work shoes approaching my table. Good afternoon. Welcome to Le Petit Jardin. My name is Madison, and I will be taking care of you today. Can I start you off with an appetizer, or perhaps a look at our wine selection? The voice was exhausted, strained, and painfully familiar. It lacked the arrogant, piercing shriek that usually defined her tone. It was the beaten, submissive voice of a service worker desperate not to anger a high-paying customer. I slowly locked my tablet screen. I placed it gently onto the pristine white tablecloth. Then I looked up. Madison was standing next to my booth. She wore a tight, uncomfortable black uniform shirt that stretched awkwardly over her pregnant belly. A thick white canvas apron was tied around her waist, stained near the pocket, with what looked like balsamic vinaigrette. Her hair, which used to cost hundreds of dollars to maintain, was pulled back into a messy, frizzy knot. She held a cheap plastic notepad and a pen, her posture slumped from carrying heavy trays all afternoon. She had not looked at my face when she delivered her rehearsed greeting. Her eyes had been focused on her notepad. But when the silence stretched on for a fraction of a second too long, Madison finally looked up. Her pen slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the marble floor. All the blood rushed out of her face, leaving her completely pale. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. She stumbled backward, her rubber shoes squeaking against the tile, nearly crashing into a busboy carrying a tray of empty glasses. The realization hit her with the crushing weight of a falling building. The wealthy, untouchable client she was assigned to serve the woman she had to fetch bread and pour water for was the sister she had slapped across the face and banished into the snow. I did not smile. I did not glare. I simply looked up at her with the polite, empty patience of a patron waiting for their table service to begin. Madison stood completely paralyzed, her chest heaving under her stained uniform, her eyes locked onto mine as if looking at a ghost. The busboy behind her cleared his throat loudly, annoyed by the sudden roadblock she had created in the narrow dining aisle. The sharp sound snapped Madison out of her trance. She quickly crouched down her swollen belly, making the movement incredibly awkward, and fumbled to pick up her dropped pen from the mosaic tile. When she stood back up, her face was burning with a deep, furious shade of humiliation. She opened her mouth, her jaw trembling, clearly struggling to find words. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reunion. I did not acknowledge our shared blood. I treated her exactly the way she had treated every single service worker she had ever encountered during her 35 years of unearned privilege. I treated her like she was completely invisible. "I will take the sparkling water, please," I said, my voice crisp, professional, and entirely dismissive. "With a slice of lemon. And we will need a few more minutes with the appetizers. My associate is running slightly behind." Madison swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She wanted to scream. I could see the old entitled rage flashing behind her tired eyes. She wanted to throw the menu storm out of the restaurant and demand respect. But the harsh, heavy chains of her new reality anchored her firmly to the floor. She had rent due. She had a baby coming. She had no husband to bail her out, and no father to fund her tantrums. She was trapped in the cold, unforgiving world she had mocked her entire life. "Right away, ma'am," Madison whispered, her voice completely defeated. She turned on her rubber-soled shoes and hurried toward the service station. My real estate client arrived a few minutes later, a sharp, aggressive developer looking to secure funding for a massive commercial project. We dove straight into the negotiations. For the next hour, Madison was forced to wait on us hand and foot. She had to approach the table with her head bowed, carefully pouring San Pellegrino into my crystal glass, her hands shaking so badly that the bottle clinked loudly against the rim. She had to stand silently while I confidently dissected a $50 million contract, listening as a powerful man deferred to my financial expertise. The ultimate torture for Madison was not that I was mocking her, it was my absolute chilling indifference. I did not make snide comments about her uniform. I did not accidentally spill wine on her apron to return the favor from Thanksgiving. I simply let her perform her menial labor, completely ignoring her presence, while I wielded the kind of corporate power she used to pretend Jamal possessed. When the lunch concluded and the developer shook my hand to seal our lucrative deal, Madison returned to clear our plates. She used a small metal crumber to meticulously scrape the breadcrumbs off the white tablecloth right in front of my chest. It was the absolute lowest point of her life, performing manual labor for the sister she had slapped and banished. She placed the leather check folder on the table. I did not look at the total. I pulled out my heavy metal corporate card and handed it to her. She processed the payment and returned the slip for my signature. The bill was nearly $300. I picked up the pen and wrote the tip. $1,000. I did not do it out of pity. I did not do it to be kind. I did it because it was the final devastating nail in the coffin of her pride. Leaving a massive life-saving tip for my ruined sister was the ultimate display of absolute supremacy. It forced her to make a brutal choice. She could either tear up the receipt to preserve her last shred of dignity, or she could swallow her pride, accept my charity, and use my money to buy groceries. I signed my name with a sharp flourish, stood up, and buttoned my suit jacket. I walked out of the French bistro without a single backward glance, leaving Madison staring at the receipt with fresh, agonizing tears streaming down her face. She kept the money. The power dynamic was permanently cemented. Later that afternoon, my driver navigated the familiar winding roads of the Greenwich suburbs. We passed the massive iron gates and pulled into the circular driveway of the estate. The heavy winter snow had melted away, revealing the sprawling green lawns of early spring. But the property looked fundamentally different. There were no luxury sports cars parked near the garage. There were no caterers setting up for an exclusive cocktail party. Instead, the driveway was lined with heavy-duty work trucks, commercial dumpsters, and scaffolding. I had not moved into the mansion. I had zero intention of living in a house poisoned by decades of narcissistic abuse and shallow materialism. But I had not sold it to another wealthy family either. I had found a much more poetic use for Richard and Patricia's former kingdom. I stepped through the front doors, bypassing the grand foyer where I had once been threatened by a fraudulent tech CEO. The interior was completely unrecognizable. The expensive Italian leather sofas and the antique Persian rugs were gone. The walls had been stripped down to the studs. Construction crews wearing hard hats were tearing out the custom mahogany fixtures. I walked into the massive dining room, the exact spot where the Thanksgiving massacre had taken place. The long, formal dining table had been replaced by a sprawling sheet of plywood covered in architectural blueprints. The general contractor, a rugged, no-nonsense man who was managing the massive renovation, looked up as I approached. "Good afternoon, Becca," he said, tapping a pencil against the schematics. "The demolition phase on the second floor is officially complete. We have successfully reconfigured the master suites into individual residential dormitories. The industrial kitchen upgrade has passed the city inspection, and the communal counseling rooms on the ground floor are ready for drywall tomorrow." I looked down at the blueprints, tracing the new layout with my finger. I was converting the multi-million-dollar estate into the primary residential headquarters for a newly registered non-governmental organization. The foundation, fully funded by a portion of my investment firm's profits, was specifically designed to provide emergency housing, financial literacy training, and legal support for young adults who had been financially abused, manipulated, or abandoned by their toxic families. I was physically ripping out the legacy of Richard's arrogant exclusivity and replacing it with a sanctuary for people who had survived the exact same trauma I had. The house that was meant to be a monument to their fake superiority was going to become a monument to their victims. "The plans look flawless," I said, pulling a sleek pen from my jacket pocket. You have authorization to proceed with the final construction phase. Let us get this facility operational by autumn. I signed my name across the bottom of the master permit, officially greenlighting the final transformation of the estate. The heavy, dark energy of my past felt like it was finally dissolving into the fresh spring air, blowing through the open, gutted windows. Just as the ink dried on the paper, my phone buzzed violently against the wooden table. I picked up the device. The screen illuminated with a new message notification. It was not an email from Victor or a calendar alert from my assistant. It was a massive, sprawling wall of text from an unsaved number. I did not need caller identification to recognize the desperate, frantic cadence of the writing. It was from Patricia. The message was a frantic, rambling essay filled with spelling errors and wild emotional swings. She detailed the absolute misery of the roach-infested apartment in Queens. She complained about her swollen feet from her retail job. And then, burying the lead beneath a mountain of self-pity, came the ultimate sickening request. She was begging for a loan. She claimed Madison's due date was approaching, the baby was coming, and they had absolutely zero cash for a crib formula or basic medical supplies. Patricia was invoking the name of her unborn grandchild, desperately pleading for family loyalty, and begging me to wire them emergency funds before they were completely destitute. I stood in the center of the gutted dining room, the heavy construction dust swirling in the shafts of early spring sunlight. My eyes traced the frantic, sprawling block of text glowing on my phone screen. Patricia had managed to pack 33 years of toxic manipulation, gaslighting, and absolute delusion into a single digital message. "Becca, you have to help us!" The text began with a desperate, pleading tone before immediately pivoting into aggressive demands. "Madison is due in 3 weeks. We have absolutely zero cash. The baby needs a crib formula and winter clothes. You cannot let your own flesh and blood sleep in a cardboard box in a roach-infested apartment in Queens. Jamal ruined us completely. We are victims here. You have millions of dollars. You proved your point, but now an innocent child is involved. You are an aunt. We are your family. God will punish your cold heart if you turn your back on a helpless baby. Wire us $10,000 right now. Call me immediately." I stared at the glowing pixels. I stood in the exact physical location where just months ago my father had thrown me out into a freezing blizzard to protect a fraud. I stood where my mother had watched my sister slap me across the face and then rushed to check if my sister's maternity dress had been stained. I waited for the familiar burning spike of adrenaline to hit my chest. I waited for the crushing weight of lifelong guilt to settle over my shoulders. I waited for the desperate, screaming urge to type out a massive, thoroughly documented response detailing exactly how they had brought this absolute ruin upon themselves. I waited to feel the need to defend my character against her threat of divine punishment. But as I stood there listening to the distant rhythmic hammering of the construction crew rebuilding the estate, the profound realization washed over me. The adrenaline never came. The guilt was completely evaporated. The anger, the bitter resentment, the desperate childhood need to force them to understand my perspective, it was all entirely gone. I looked at the message, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no sadness. There was no joy. There was no petty, vindictive thrill at reading my mother beg for scraps. I looked at the frantic words of a woman who had spent my entire life breaking my spirit, and I felt the exact same level of emotional attachment I would feel reading a spam email from a stranger. The opposite of love is not hate. Hate requires passion. Hate requires energy. Hate requires you to care deeply about the object of your fury. The true opposite of love is absolute chilling indifference. Patricia was trying to use a yet-to-be-born child as a financial hostage. She was refusing to acknowledge that Richard had gambled their entire existence on a Ponzi scheme. She was demanding I fix a disaster they had violently engineered. Sending her $10,000 would not save that baby. It would just feed the parasite. It would teach them that my boundaries were negotiable, that if they cried loud enough and used enough religious guilt, the ATM would magically turn back on. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not send a witty, devastating comeback to remind her that she was currently living in the exact poverty she used to mock. They had already faced their legal and financial executions. My participation in their narrative was officially over. I tapped the small information icon at the top of the unsaved number. I scrolled down past the location data and the notification settings. I pressed my thumb against the bright red text at the very bottom of the screen. Block this caller. A confirmation window popped up warning me that I would not receive phone calls, messages, or FaceTime from people on the block list. I did not hesitate. I tapped block. Then I swiped left on the entire message thread and hit delete. The screen blinked, returning to my empty, pristine inbox. The digital umbilical cord was permanently, irreversibly severed. I slipped the phone back into the pocket of my tailored navy suit. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh air blowing through the open, windowless frames of the mansion. "Is the layout to your satisfaction, Becca?" The general contractor walked over, rolling up a set of large architectural blueprints. "It is flawless," I said, offering him a firm handshake. "Keep the teams moving. I want the sanctuary fully operational before the first snowfall. Send the final invoices directly to my corporate office." I turned my back on the gutted estate. I did not take a lingering, sentimental look at the property. It was no longer a monument to my childhood trauma or a trophy of my financial revenge. It was just wood, concrete, and drywall. It was simply another asset in my portfolio currently being repurposed for a better cause. I walked out the front doors, stepped into the back of my waiting town car, and told my driver to head straight back to Manhattan. The drive into the city was smooth and quiet. I watched the towering steel and glass skyscrapers rise up along the horizon, their sharp edges cutting through the bright blue spring sky. I arrived at my corporate headquarters, stepping into the private elevator that shot me up to the top floor of the financial high-rise. The polished glass doors of my firm slid open. The ambient hum of high-stakes finance filled the air. Analysts were tracking global markets. Associates were reviewing distressed debt portfolios. I walked past them, all my heels clicking confidently against the marble floor, completely in my element. I approached the massive glass-walled boardroom at the end of the hall. My executive team was already seated around the long table, reviewing the projections for our next multi-million-dollar acquisition. As I opened the heavy glass door, the morning sunlight flooded the room, reflecting brilliantly off the polished mahogany table and illuminating the panoramic view of the empire I had built entirely with my own two hands. My phone remained completely silent in my pocket. I took my seat at the head of the table. I looked at the brilliant, dedicated professionals who respected my intellect, valued my leadership, and stood by me through every corporate battle. This was my true family. This was my legacy. I opened my portfolio, feeling a profound, absolute lightness in my chest. For the first time in 33 years, there was no shadow looming over my shoulder. There were no arrogant voices telling me I was not enough. I looked out at the bright, endless horizon of the city skyline and I smiled. It was not a smile of vengeance or a smirk of petty victory. It was a genuine, beautiful, completely unburdened smile. I had survived the fire, I had burned their fraudulent kingdom to ash, and now the rest of my life belonged solely to me. The story of Becca's financial revenge highlights a profound lesson about healing. True power doesn't come from vengeance, but from absolute indifference. For years, she chased the validation of a toxic family that viewed her as disposable. Yet her ultimate victory wasn't seizing their mansion or freezing their accounts. It was reading her mother's desperate text and feeling absolutely nothing. This teaches us that we cannot heal by waiting for our abusers to change. Instead, we must reclaim our narrative and build our own success. If you've ever had to cut toxic ties to protect your peace, share your story and comment below.